Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and this is Stitched Up, and welcome back to another Top Tip Tuesday. So this week's episode we are going to be sort of following on from last week, where I showed you how I insert invisible zips into garments. And what I thought I would do, because I know a few of you mentioned they would love to have seen it completely finished with a facing or a lining. So that's what we're covering this week. So I have the original insertion that I did last week here, and I'm going to be showing you how to complete it with a facing or a lining. I know there's a little bit of a jog there, but this is for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to be showing you how to do this. This is completed on my sewing machine. I don't hand stitch my linings or facings down inside. I do it all on the sewing machine. And what I do as well is I always have my zip going right up to the top of the garment. I know that a lot of patterns will tell you to do it a little bit lower and then put a hook and eye on. I don't like that finish personally, and the reason for that is because I find hooks and eyes always end up catching in those little baby hairs at the back of your neck and causing me pain, and I don't like that. So I prefer this kind of finish where the zip goes all the way to the top of the garment, and it's just a neater finish that I prefer. So that's the way I do it, and that's what we're going to be showing you today. So without further ado, let's get into it, and I hope you enjoy it. If you've got any questions, as always, please leave them in the comments down below for me, and yeah, I will see you again really soon. Take care, bye. So here we have our invisible zip that we inserted last week. If you haven't seen that vlog, I will just link to it up above so you can go and check that out, but just checking that the zip is working and everything looks fine. So what we're going to do today is we are going to insert a lining. So here are my two lining pieces. I'm just showing you the edges here to show you that you don't actually need to finish those. So what we're going to do is we're going to work on one side first and then the other side, and we need to attach these right sides together. So undoing your zip first and working with one side of your lining. The technique is the same whether you're just applying a facing or a lining. You need to just turn out the invisible zip fully. So working right sides together, pin the lining to your front piece along the top edge here, and I'm just showing you there where you are going to be pinning all along the top. And you need to make sure that when you're stitching this, you are stitching at the correct seam allowance for your garment. So if you followed last week's vlog, you will have noticed that when we aligned the invisible zip with the top raw edge of the bodice piece, you needed to align it as to whatever your seam allowance is at the top, because I've aligned mine directly with the top because the seam allowance on my zip is 5/8 of an inch before it hits the actual zip. And so I've pinned that with the top, and I'm going to be stitching along the top at 5/8 of an inch. So the zipper stop will zip right up to the finished edge of my garment. So we've moved across to the sewing machine now, and we're sewing along the top edge, so stitching the facing or lining, whichever it is that you're using, to the finished bodice, right sides together, and stitching at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is going to cover the excess zip tape at the top of this zip, which I'm just highlighting here. So this amount here is 5/8 of an inch above the zip tape, and I'm stitching close to that so that this will zip all the way up to the top of the garment when it's completed. You shouldn't have any issue stitching over a nylon zip like this. Obviously a metal zip you need to be really careful because it will break your needle, but because I'm using a nylon zip it should be fine. So you can see the zipper stop at the top of the zip comes all the way up to the top. So this is how it looks now with your seam there and opening out the bodice. What we're going to do next is we're going to give that seam a good press, and then we're going to understitch. And understitching just helps your lining or your facing to sit really neatly on the inside of your garment so that it doesn't actually peek out at the top. One of those steps that when I first started sewing I used to skip, thinking that it wasn't important, but it really does make a difference. So here we've got the bodice on the left hand side, and on the right hand side is the lining, and I am stitching through the lining, working from the right side of the garment with the seam allowance underneath pressed through under the lining. So we're stitching the lining to the seam allowance, and then what you'll see when this is completed is that we've got the line of understitching there that is going to be hidden inside because it's on the inside of the garment on the lining, and then it's stitched the seam allowance down to it. That's from the wrong side, so you can see a line of the original stitching line and then the understitching line there, and this will mean that it will sit really neatly inside the garment, so when you're wearing it, it's not going to peek out. So this is what it should look like now. We're going to fold the lining to the wrong side, so we're working from the wrong side here. This is the lining faced up. We're going to go and give this a press, and then when you've given it a press, it should look something like so. So we're looking at it from the right side of the garment. Up at the top here is the lining. To do now is we need to stitch the lining to the zip. So what we do here is we make sure we fold over the lining, making sure we're folding from the seam line. So I'm folding that right over the zip here, and we're going to pin this in place first. It's really tempting to fold over just where the actual understitching line is, but you need to make sure that you fold it right over from your original seam line when you sewed your bodice and lining together. So we're going to pin this in place, and when we go to the sewing machine, we're going to be stitching it with our zipper foot. You can hand stitch down if you want to instead, so you would leave it wrong sides together and then just tuck it under and hand stitch it, but we're doing this on the sewing machine. So here we are with our normal zipper foot again to do this next step. So I'm just changing my presser foot to my zipper foot, and we don't move the needle for this because we want to make sure we don't get too close to the coils when we are stitching down the lining, otherwise you'll probably have difficulty zipping it up, which we don't want. So we're starting at the top and we are butting up the edge of the zipper foot to the coils, but leaving the needle in its central position. I decided at this point that I would just take out the pins just to show you how this should look before we actually start stitching it. So we've got it folded over right from the original seam line, not the understitching that we did, and then we're going to be stitching it down. And give it a bit of a press. You want to make sure all of the tape is facing towards the raw edge, so you will have a bit of the zip tape at the top that is folded over, but that's okay. It's going to be a little bit of a bulk, but it's not going to make any difference in wearing. So I'm just now butting up these edges together, and we're going to sew straight down so that we're sewing the lining to the bodice right sides together along the zipper tape. And again, you don't move your needle, keep your needle in its central position at this point so that you don't get too close to the coils, because that's not going to matter. Now if you're doing a bodice, I've made a bit of an error here because I cut out a really big piece of lining to sort of demonstrate this, but if you're doing a bodice, and you're doing a lining, you'll be attaching your lining to your bodice on the inside. So what you would need to do is you would fold up the bottom edge of your lining piece here, wrong sides together, so that when you're flipping it right sides out, you've got sort of a bit of a hem there that you can then hand stitch down to the seam on the inside of your bodice and lining. I will show you how that works a little bit later when I finally realise what I've done wrong. So we're just going to cut off this corner edge now, and you want to cut off from the zip without cutting too far down. I'm struggling with these snips here because they're new, and I've not figured out that that thumb hole is not a thumb hole. It's for it should be at the bottom, but anyway, we get there. Yeah, we're going to snip off this corner edge, making sure that you don't cut through any of the stitching, and it just takes off that little bit of bulk there. And then you should have something that looks like this. So you've got your little corner that you've just snipped off there. What we're going to do is turn this right side out now, and you should be able to just manipulate this through, pressing through that corner so it's nice and neat. And then we've got the lining nicely attached to the zipper tape on the inside. We're going to give it a press, and then we're going to work on the other side. And I seem to have missed out a little bit here. I think I didn't record when I should have done, but basically we're just repeating exactly the same thing on the other side. So we've stitched the lining to the bodice, and we've understitched it at the top, and then we've just folded it over again, pinning the raw edges together. So I'm pinning the raw edge of the lining to the zipper tape again, right sides together, and then we're going to take it back to the sewing machine and stitch down this edge as well. What I haven't mentioned is if you're working on a curved seam, which if this is a bodice and it's a neckline, it's generally going to be a curved seam, you need to snip into your curves within the seam allowance before you understitch, and then it will just make sure that that edge sits really nice and neatly when it's understitched and your garment's completed. So we're back at the sewing machine now. I've changed back to my zipper foot, and again with the needle still in the central position, we are just stitching the lining to the bodice, right sides together along the zipper tape. And then again we are just snipping off the corner, making sure we don't cut through any of those stitching lines. I'm still struggling with those snips, but I got the hang of it after this, believe it or not. I figured out how to use them. And then we are turning it right sides through, and I'm just doing this here close up so you can see how I poke out that edge of the zip, and then you can take it to the iron and give it everything a good press. And then you should have something that looks like this. You've got your lining to the inside, and then from the outside we can zip it up. And if we flip it over, you've got a really nice neat finish on the inside with your lining. So this is the bit here where I realised that what I should have shown you was how to finish the lining inside and stitch to the inside seam of your bodice. So I'm just folding it up here, and if you imagine that this is at the waist seam underneath, and what you would do is you would just fold up your seam allowance here, give those a press, and then you can hand stitch it to the waistline seam of your garment underneath. So I'm just showing you that there, and then it would be completely finished on the inside. And that's our fully lined bodice completed.